Today we're joined by Dr. Leonardo Cardoso, and we're going to be talking about the issue of pancadões in sound politics. Welcome, Dr. Cardoso.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for joining us today. So I guess to get us started, we wanted to talk a little bit about what is a pancadão, what are pancadões, and could you give us a little bit of history or the influences of those?
Okay, so the word pancadão means literally big thump. And it is a word that had different meanings in Brazil, especially in relation to funk carioca. So it started in reference to the funk parties in Rio, not of course as something negative, but just in reference to how powerful the speakers were supposed to be, and this idea of having sound teams competing in funk parties. This was something common, and this idea is also very popular in other places in Latin America and the Caribbean. You have the Jamaica sound system, which was also something that you would have a competition between different sound teams, and eventually when hip-hop arrived in Brazil, it was assimilated in Rio through a genre of hip-hop called Miami bass. And Miami bass, as the name already makes it explicit, it's really about powerful, lower frequency, powerful bass. And in the funk parties, when they started to explode, the idea of having a powerful sound system with really powerful bass was what every sound team would want to have. So the funk parties is basically something that predates, that comes before what is today known as funk carioca. Funk parties, they were popular in the 70s. That's when it started. Part of a movement called Black Rio, that you would have in the working class neighborhoods. You would have these parties playing James Brown, mostly international, actually, the funk from the 70s.
Right.
So they became known as funk parties. And at that point, you have the sound systems that I was referring to. Later in the 80s, in the late 80s, Miami bass arrives, and they stick with the name funk parties, even though it's something closer to hip hop. Even though the music changed, the parties were still called funk parties. So that's why it became funk carioca.
Right.
And then at the early 2000s, people start to refer as pancadão. The funk parties would be called pancadão, and pancadão could refer to funk carioca. So it could refer to music, it could refer to the party, and it could refer to the rhythm itself, right, of the Miami bass. And then pancadão in the late 2000s, I would say 2008, pancadão starts to have a different meaning when these funk parties, they migrate from Rio to São Paulo. And when you have the funk parties in São Paulo, first of all, they happen again in the streets. In Rio, you would have mostly clubs, and they happen indoors, clubs, and in São Paulo, they happen in the streets. So they start to refer to it as street pancadão, pancadão de rua, and then at some point they just drop the rua and they just say pancadão. So pancadão went from a music genre, a party in Rio, to this word that had this kind of negative connotation of disorderly, parties going on in the streets of São Paulo.
Okay. And then could you give us an idea of some of the aesthetic elements of the pancadão? For example, is there like competition between different brands of speakers or sound systems? Is there emphasis on the types of cars that are used? Also, what about social media? How does that go into or tie into the idea of the pancadão as it is now, or kind of in that turning point since 2008?
Okay, so the question about the aesthetics, the competition. I mentioned that in Rio you would have the sound teams, right?
Right.
So at that point you would have not much about the brand of the speakers, but just loudness itself was a signifier of professionalism and how cool the party would be, because of the sound teams would be able to gather a lot of people because they invested more money, so they were more professional. So loudness itself was a signifier of professionalism. Now, when you talk about the Pancadão in São Paulo, there's a very important difference in technology, because the Pancadões in São Paulo, they are mobile.
Right.
They are coming from car audio, the sound equipment that they start to install in the cars. Now, that was not always the case. I know that you would have a lot of Pancadões happening around the quermesses, which are parties that happen in June. They have a religious part of the Catholic calendar. So they would happen during that moment of tolerance, because during this religious holiday you would have a lot of people on the streets, and you have some parties, not exactly like Carnival,
right,
but there is a certain level of tolerance to what happens. And this holiday is extremely popular in the Northeast,
right,
and as you know, in São Paulo you have a really heavy migration of people from Northeast states like Bahia, Maranhão. So what happens is that when these Pancadões would happen in this Catholic holiday, the police would start to come and basically dismantle the parties before they would occur. So one of the ways to circumvent that the youth found was to make it mobile.
Right.
So that was a kind of a very clever move. So what happens is whenever the police would come, they would basically move the party to somewhere else. And that's where social media was so important. Facebook was always used to create the events. So you would just create an event, a public event on Facebook, and then people would confirm, so you'd have an idea of how the size of the party, basically. Now, the other important aspect of social media here is basically exchanging information about the eventual arrival of the police, where they would go, so they could basically create potential locations that they would go whenever the police would get to the place where the original party was supposed to be.
Right.
So they would use WhatsApp, they would use Twitter to make these last minute adjustments of the party location. So when you get to this Pancadões in with the cars, I wouldn't say that there was a lot of competition like you would have the sound teams in Rio.
Right.
Because not necessarily the car owners were organizing the parties. Like in Rio, the sound teams, they were marketing everything. They would sell tickets. They would make money with that. With the Pancadão, it's different, because a car would just listen the Pancadão coming from one street, and then he would drive there and play his car system. There is a certain competition, but not in explicit.
Right.
There might be some comparison there, but you would have like different cars playing different songs at the same time. They would be a few feet apart from each other, and that would be the part, And the friends that invited the car owner, they would stay around the car.
Okay.
So it could be from 1 to 10 cars usually playing at the same time.
Wow. Could you tell us a little bit about the reaction to these new types of mobile parties, and kind of like where they were occurring, and what was the reaction, what was the reception, and possibly the misconceptions that came out of that?
Okay. the reactions were, first of all, I think it's not particularly accurate to say that this is a class issue only, because I went to the community meetings, and I heard local people complaining about the noise. You know, it's really, in my view, a lot of it is a generational gap of youth having fun, and then you have older people saying, you know, this is absurd that we have a noise. So, you know, every weekend we want to work and we have to wake up early, so we need to make this stop. So it is also something inside the community, an issue inside the community. And the middle class, of course, demonized these parties. And this is not exactly new, because this very similar thing happened in Rio, right? When you have this association of funk carioca with criminality.
Right.
And you even have a genre of funk carioca called the proibidão, or the prohibited funk, where you talk about criminal activity, you talk about drug trafficking, and you kind of praise the criminals. And that's what people would think that funk carioca is about. This is one version of funk carioca. So I think a lot of that idea of funk carioca is being closely related, if not coming from the criminals, drug dealers in Rio. I think a lot of people imported that impression. And you had that moral panic in Rio de Janeiro, especially with the famous arrastões, which is, how would you translate that? That's hard to translate, but it's basically what happened in beaches in the southern district of Rio, like Copacabana, where you have dozens of teenagers stealing, like running around on the beach and stealing things from mostly tourists. And that became a super controversial topic about these minors losing the sense of what was acceptable. They were just stealing, and then people saw, okay, these are people who are at the funk parties. So the association was like, okay, funk, carioca, and funk parties are part of this kind of criminal network. And in São Paulo it was similar. The response was, this is articulated by drug dealers. And in 2008, I remember about a newspaper story talking about, oh, these funk parties, it's just a way for drug dealers to sell more, because it's relatively safe for even middle-class teenagers to come and to buy drugs, and they can make much more profit than it would do in a regular, business day. So that was associated with that, and the police, of course, kind of helped to promote this idea, that, okay, so it is about drugs, so therefore we can dismantle it and use, rubber bullets and stun grenades, because it is part of this criminal ring that is so strong in the peripheries of São Paulo.
So you bring up the question of law enforcement and kind of the media's reaction to this. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how the sound politics starts to come into play when you talk about pancadões.
Okay, so here's the thing. The police could not do much once they got at the party, right, at this pancadão happening in the streets. They didn't have enough to put people in jail. They didn't have a lot to enforce the law, because they have to bring order. But here's the thing, according to the law, the police cannot do much without a victim. And who would be the brave person that would say, okay, I would like to make a criminal report against this bunch of teenagers? Nobody would want to do that. The call the police, they complain, but when they had to go to the police station to make an official report, nobody wanted to do that. So the police basically didn't have much. So what they did is that they tried to approach this problem by measuring the noise coming from the cars.
Okay.
And they would be able to find the car owner, and they would hope that would make party organizers give up, because it would damage. But actually the fines are not super expensive. It's close to the price of one equipment. Some of the equipment, the car audio is like $2,000. It's super expensive, even sometimes more expensive than the car itself. So the police tried to work with the anti-noise agency, where they did some field work, and the anti-noise agency would go and they would measure the noise, and with the noise they'd be able to find $50, and they wouldn't be able to apprehend the car. So the police was really frustrated with that, and it became an issue of sound politics, because it kind of took a lot of the staff that the anti-noise agency had just to work towards the Pancado. So they wouldn't be able to work other places like finding bars or doing something else. They would just focus on the Pancado problem.
Right. So I guess when they started this heavy enforcement against the Pancadons, with the Pancadons, and they started using these the law itself to kind of crack down on them, or the noise measures to crack down. What was the reaction from the party organizers, the car owners? Was there some type of resistance, or did they find a way around it?
Right. So definitely, once the police started to try to dismantle the parties, they created something called Operação Pancadão, which is the kind of Pancadão task force operation that they would try to, basically have police officers going on Facebook, trying to figure out where the parties are going to be, and they would get there. Either they would get there before the parties started, and they would occupy the party place, or they would send people to the party, of course disguised, and they would say, okay, the party's going on here. They would go to the party and dismantle and use, non-lethal weapons to do that. Now, the first Pancadões of São Paulo, they would gather thousands of people, 2,000-3,000 people partying, have a bunch of cars, and of course, if you have a huge party, it is harder to relocate, right? So when the police would start, when the police would arrive, they would be able to get a few cars and find them, and fine. So what they did after the police started with this Operação Pancadão, this task force, they started to make smaller parties, like 200 people.
Right.
And that would be much more flexible, so they could move around the party easier. And at that point, I would say that it's late 2012, and what you have is that lawmakers start to come to the scene, and they start to create laws specifically to address that issue. So one thing, you have two laws that they try to pass, and by the way, these laws are pretty much from the so-called Bancada da Bala, or the Bullet Caucus in São Paulo, retired police officers that they ran and to the concealment. They became municipal lawmakers, and the most strong political agenda. That's how they won the election, is because they would say that they would bring safety and they would bring an end to this kind of disorder in the city. So they had to. So
it became their political forum.
Became their political. So you have this bill that says, any car that is playing music at a certain limit you have a very heavy fine, and they would apprehend the car. And that law passed in 2013. Now the other law is very addressing the issue of parties in the public space. So from now on, and the bill explicitly mentions funk parties as a problem in São Paulo. And basically what you have is you would need permission to organize any party. You need the presence of the police. So it was really bureaucratic, a lot of paperwork that people would have to gather to organize a party. That bill didn't pass. The mayor said that's that's a very controversial issue to kind of prohibit youth from partying, but not giving them any space to do so. And it became an issue of space, right?
Okay.
The leisure. There is no place to party in the peripheries. They were occupied, informally, and so there was no planning about distributing, making more heterogeneous. You would have churches, bars, but you don't have a place that the youth could go to party. So the mayor realized that, so he vetoed the bill. And then after that, what you had is it's a controversial issue if the law actually worked. I don't think there was a lot of enforcement with this law to find the car and apprehend. And then in June 2013, you had the street protest in Brazil, right? That's when it started, this huge protest against corruption and about the World Cup is extremely not necessarily a good thing for Brazilians, and how the government was kind of selling out to make FIFA happy.
Okay.
So you have this huge street protest, and then you have again a lot of controversy with the police force, violence abuse and stuff like that. So at that point, the press and the media and the moral panic, they kind of stopped to focus on the Pancadão. And so the Pancadão, I would say that it's not that present anymore in São Paulo.
So going forward, I guess to wrap things up, you mentioned you don't see it as present now, but you think it's something that will come back. Whenever we talk about contemporary Brazil, or right now,
right.
It's a developing nation. It's more than a developing nation.
Yeah.
It's at the center of a lot of different discussions. We talked about the World Cup, the Olympics, and things like that.
Right.
How do you think that will impact the Pancadão, or do you see a resurgence or some other thing taking its place?
Okay, that's a good question. I just want to mention that there is another very important issue that is related to Pancadão, and it's the emergence of a new subgenre of funk carioca from São Paulo.
Okay.
And Paulistanos are very proud of their own version of funk. It's called funk ostentação, or ostentations funk, which is very much car-centered, like you would have for instance, in Houston hip-hop. You'd have this emphasis on the car. So that helped to kind of make the Pancadão so popular. Now, when the Pancadão died, funk ostentação, by the way, is still strong, right? But the Pancadão, the party format, kind of disappeared. And what you had in 2013 and 2014 is what they call the rolezinhos. So the rolezinhos are events, again, that the youth organize on Facebook. They make the event, and you have thousands of people confirming and going to this event. And they happen in the shopping malls, either the parking lot or inside the shopping mall.
Right.
And that, again, created a huge moral panic in the press, right? Because the press, the middle class in São Paulo, I don't think they know how to deal with the peripheries. I think they had preconceptions about what the periphery is and what the youth wants. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings there. So they thought that, this youth going to the malls, they were going to steal stuff. Right? What the ostentação movement tells them to have, Lacoste shirts, Oakley sunglasses, and they cannot buy that, so they would steal. That's a misconception, a misunderstanding of the whole movement, that the middle class, they maintain that, and the press co-opted with this idea. So the Jalezinhos created a huge controversy, and you have shopping mall owners trying to find a legal excuse that would bar youth from entering the shopping malls. And so it's a huge problem, because it's a public space or a semi-public space where they are paying the taxes and they have a bunch of privileges from the city public sector, but still they found a way to bar, and that became a huge problem because of the racial overtones that kind of attitude had. But the Jalezinhos, they wouldn't have the sound. They would be just to get together and flirt, and to get to know this huge community that, thanks to Facebook, they kind of have an idea of the size of this funk carioca movement in São Paulo. So they want to see each other, and they want a place to meet, and they don't have that place. That's something that will continue. I'm sure that they would find different formats, and I think at this point, São Paulo is starting to. The lawmakers are starting to realize that just creating the fines and just creating this kind of aggression against the youth is not going to work. And I think it's something that happened in São Paulo, became an issue of cultural rights. Funk carioca is a cultural right. I mean, it's not because you like funk carioca, it's not because you go to a funk party that you should be seen as a criminal, especially not from the lawmakers and the police. But I still think that there's a long way to go until funk carioca and funk ostentação will be seen as something that deserves the space, as a leisure space in the city.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I understand you have a website also kind of dedicated to the project that you've been working on.
Yes, it's www.sound-politics.org, and I'm still updating stuff there, so feel free to come and give me feedback. It'd be awesome.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.